Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Ling, and this is The Road to a Vaccine, a weekly live educational program exploring the COVID-19 crisis and the global community's efforts to develop a vaccine candidate against the disease. Now, as a journalist and as an ordinary citizen, I'm looking for answers and eager to learn more about the latest science and technology approaches to tackling coronavirus. I'm excited to be collaborating with Johnson & Johnson on this show because I know that people are just hungry for information and wanting to hear directly from trusted sources. So each week, while social distancing, like everyone else, I'll be connecting remotely with the world's leading experts to talk about the different approaches being taken to combat this epidemic. And we'll talk to guests from the front line. We'll also be answering your questions live. So put your questions in the comment section and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the show. Now, we all know that these are unprecedented times. We are in the midst of a deadly public health crisis with a virus that has no known treatment, and a vaccine is critical to truly curtail this pandemic. So how do we get there? That's the question we're going to be answering step by step each week on this show. Now, recently, Johnson & Johnson made a very important announcement, the selection of a lead vaccine candidate for COVID-19 and a commitment to supply 1 billion vaccines worldwide for emergency authorization pandemic use. I recently had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Paul Stoffels, J&J's Vice Chairman and Chief Scientific Officer, who is leading J&J's efforts to find out more. Dr. Stoffels, it's such a pleasure to speak with you. Now, throughout your career as an infectious disease physician, dating back to your medical training in Africa and your lifelong quest against HIV, the fight against Ebola, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-2, you really know viruses. So how is COVID-19 different from viruses of the past?
Well, it's different that it does two things. It's spreading extremely fast around the world. It's a new virus, and therefore people have not seen this type of virus, and there's no immunity in the world, and people can get very sick from this virus. So it's a combination of all what we have seen before. It's spreading stealth because you can spread it before you're sick. It's a little bit like HIV. And then with like we have seen with Ebola, it can be very lethal in certain people. So the combination of that is a disaster for the world. And it's a global pandemic now.
Now, is there a world in which shelter-at-home orders, so much of the world is under them right now, could just continue until a vaccine is developed?
Well, I think that's going to be very difficult. A vaccine can be developed probably in the next 12 to 18 months. Many different pathways to a vaccine at the moment by different companies. Very important that that's happening. We now get under control. You see that in China, in Korea, in several countries. It looks like people with the right measures get the virus under control. It could come back in smaller pockets around the country, but with the track and trace where you diagnose, you follow, and you isolate the people who are infected, it is possible to control it to a certain extent. We won't go to a normal world before we have a vaccine, I think, because mass gatherings and places where there could be a huge multiplier for the disease is still a very dangerous factor for the world. So I think we'll restart society soon, but with very significant measures to make sure that the virus doesn't have the chance to go around very quickly anymore.
That is very exciting news. I don't want to get too excited, as you say, but J&J has just announced that you're developing 1 billion vaccines. How are you so confident that you can develop this vaccine, and why 1 billion?
With Ebola, we went from having a vaccine on the shelf because we were working already since some time. Within 6 months, we went from a vaccine in the lab to a vaccine in the clinic, and then starting to deploy it very quickly in emergency use situations. So we have done it before. Also, the VSV vaccine with Merck has gone through that speed. So it is possible. But the difference is that Ebola was in 3 countries in West Africa, now in a smaller region or a large region, but still limited to 10, 20 million people in Congo. So we only need in the range of a few million vaccines. Here, the difference is we are going to need billions of vaccines. And that's where there is a huge transformational change here. What we need to do now is get it from one site manufacturing to many sites in order to get very fast a vaccine to people.
And how accessible will they be?
We need to work with the health authorities in the world to see who are the highest risk people who we need to protect first, and then who are the people who are at risk, who can die easily from the coronavirus, as you all know. And so the healthcare workers, definitely, those who are in the front lines working to take care of patients every day, they put themselves at very high risk and should be the first one to be vaccinated. And then the high-risk patients, and then hopefully the whole population once we can get to the massive number of vaccines in order to vaccinate everyone. If in the end that will be needed to control the disease.
The world has just changed so much in a matter of months in the way we interact with each other. Can you imagine a world when you actually have a vaccine against COVID, and what does that world look like?
Well, there will be, I think, a world before a vaccine and a world after a vaccine. Before a vaccine, we'll have to be continuously very careful that the vaccine does not take a turn and comes again into society. So we'll have to take necessary precautions. But with the track and trace, what you have seen in many parts of the world, it is possible to control the virus and contain it. So that's important. Hopefully, we can have a world after a vaccine that COVID is gone and that we can do exactly what we did before, is enjoying life and make sure we can go to theaters, to the football matches, and that gatherings are possible. So I think that world should be very fast returning. But what will change, I think, is we'll be prepared next time. We will need the pandemic preparedness with diagnostic networks learning very fast what new viruses emerge, vaccine platforms for very fast emerging of new vaccines against these viruses, and therapeutics which can treat these viruses. So there will be a lot of activity in the scientific community to make sure this never happens again.
It's important for people who are watching this to know that throughout your career, you have been someone who just rushes to the front line. What drives you?
Well, it's a mission to make the difference in the world for patients. And I was first in my very early days of my career in Africa back in 83, 84, 85, in the early days of HIV, first as a student, then as a physician. And so the challenges that these viruses brought to society, it was 1 in 3 in Africa was infected at that moment, and families were devastated. And so I took it on me to say, let's make sure that as a physician scientist, we start working on preventing these viruses having that impact. And that took me 20 years with our teams to get to HIV medicines. Now we are contributing significant to life expectancy there. And then it becomes an art and a passion to contribute to other viruses. We worked on hepatitis C. We are working on RSV, and then on Ebola. Then on a bacteria, we also turned again to start working on TB. So, and every time it worked. And so that is what the passion is, making a huge difference in the world. And this time we are in a unique situation with the capabilities we have at the company here at Janssen and J&J to make a huge difference. And we jumped in with the entire organization very quickly. 12 weeks later, we have a lead vaccine. We invest hundreds of millions of dollars, and we got going on getting a vaccine ready. So it's a passion, a mission, but in the end, it's helping the people, which drives the people of J&J. It's us as people of Johnson & Johnson who are doing this for the world.
Dr. Paul Stoffels, thank you so much for helping to try and educate us on this process. And again, that was Dr. Paul Stoffels, Chief Scientific Officer, J&J, who I can tell you is working around the clock. I just received note that there are a lot of people watching us on LinkedIn right now, so thank you for joining us. I want to remind all of you watching to ask your questions in the comment section. We are reading them and we'll be answering some of them at the end of the show. Now, there's so much to talk about when it comes to vaccines, and I think it's important that we get a better understanding of what a vaccine actually does. And to help us get an overview, we have Dr. Rinke Bos, Principal Scientist, Vaccines at Johnson & Johnson, and she is live with us right now from the Netherlands. Hi, Dr. Bos. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to get right into it. Can you explain to us what exactly is a vaccine and how does it work?
Thanks, Lisa. Well, I'll first explain the difference between a vaccine and medicine. So it's important to know the difference. Medications are being used to treat patients, even cure patients, but these people are already sick. But of course, it would be better if we could prevent people from getting sick. So that's what vaccines can do. And we have learned over many years that vaccines can actually do that. We know that we have very effective vaccines, for example, against the measles, against rubella. We even eradicated smallpox. So a vaccine can really do that. So how would that work for the coronavirus? The coronavirus has spikes on the outside of the virus, and those spikes are needed to enter the cell. So for a vaccine, we would want to induce antibodies that can bind to those spikes to prevent the virus to enter the cell. So if you take the genetic code of that spike protein and you can put that in a vaccine, when you then inject the vaccine into people, into healthy people, your own body will start making this spike protein. The vaccine gives a signal to the immune system, and it will start producing antibodies against that spike protein. Your immune system is also very smart. It actually has a memory. So even after months or years after you have received the vaccine, if at that point you get the virus into your body, your immune system remembers that it had seen that spike protein earlier, before. So it will start making these antibodies really fast, and then these antibodies can bind the spike protein on the virus and can prevent the virus from entering the cell and prevent you from getting sick from the virus.
Would you say a vaccine is really the only way to eradicate this pandemic of COVID-19? I mean, is it possible that we could get to a point of containment where we could just go about our lives with a certain degree of normalcy?
I think to a certain degree of normalcy would be possible, but to really eradicate the virus, to make sure it won't pop up somewhere again, we really need the vaccine to prevent from people to get infected and also to prevent then that people spread it to each other.
Now, I know there's still a lot to learn about this virus, but if you take the flu vaccine, for example, that has to be altered every season because the flu changes so rapidly. Would that have to happen with COVID-19 after a vaccine is developed?
We don't know that yet for this virus. We know indeed for a virus like influenza that virus can change. So then you would need a new vaccine every year. We don't know that for this virus yet. It seems to be quite stable up till now. So for now we are focusing to make a vaccine for this virus that is causing the current pandemic.
We continuously hear the term vaccine candidate. What does vaccine candidate mean?
When you start the design and making of a vaccine, you won't just make one vaccine because we don't know exactly what the best vaccine will look like, what you exactly need. So in this case, when you take the genetic code of that spike protein, we make several designs. So you have different candidate vaccines, and you will make small amounts of the vaccine to do very extensive testing, because you want to make sure that your vaccine can indeed induce those antibodies that can stop the virus from entering the cells. So only when you find one of your candidates that can actually do that, then you can select a lead candidate that will then continue into development for clinical studies.
And how many different types of vaccines are there and different approaches that are being used to develop a vaccine, and why does the scientific community pursue several different types?
There are indeed many different approaches. Many different companies, also academic laboratories, are all looking into vaccines, trying to develop vaccines, and most of them really use different platforms of vaccines. So a platform can be described as the way you present the spike protein, in this case, to your immune system. So you can do this by presenting it as a DNA plasmid, or as RNA, or as a protein, in a viral vector, or there are many different ways. And the platform, the way you present it to the immune system, really determines how your immune system will respond and what type of immune response you induce with the vaccine. So that can be very different between these platforms. So it's very important to learn how all these platforms will induce their immune response. And we also need to learn, of course, what is needed, what type of immune response is actually needed to prevent the virus from infecting us. We don't know that yet.
Can you tell us a bit about J&J's platform, and is it a platform that has been used to tackle other diseases?
Yes, so our approach is a viral vector-based vaccine. And we take a virus that normally causes the common cold, but we take out pieces of DNA that normally make the virus replicating. So now the virus cannot replicate anymore, it cannot make people sick anymore. However, it is very good in transporting things into humans. We then put in the genetic code of the spike protein in the viral vector, and that is then our vaccine. So when you inject the vaccine, it will give the signal to the immune system that it can produce antibodies against the spike protein. And we have a lot of experience with our platform. We have used this same approach, so this vector-based vaccine, also for Ebola, for RSV, and for HIV, the virus that can cause AIDS. So we have a lot of experience. We have injected already many people, up to 50,000 people, with this vector, our platform. So we know it's safe in people, in healthy people, and we know it can induce very good immune responses. We also have the production process in place to make large amounts of this platform. So we have a lot of experience with this.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Boss, for taking the time to explain that for people like me who have no science background. And Dr. Boss is going to be staying until the end of the show to answer some of your questions. And just in case you're wondering, I'm Lisa Ling, and you're watching our weekly series, The Road to a Vaccine. We are live every Tuesday for the next 8 weeks, exploring the COVID-19 crisis and the scientific community's incredible collaborative efforts to create a vaccine. If you have questions for us, please write them in the comment section. We'll be doing a live Q&A at the end of the show. Now, for my next guest, as the pandemic progresses, like me, you're probably wondering, what does all this mean for our daily lives going forward? To find out more, we have Dr. Tom Inglesby with us. He's the director of the Center for Health Security of Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Hi, Dr. Inglesby.
Hi, Lisa. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Johns Hopkins has always been a leader in public health, but now we're seeing Hopkins data being one of the leading sources of how the pandemic is progressing. So can you tell us about your work at the center and why it's so relevant to this COVID-19 crisis right now?
So our center has been focused on studying pandemics, the potential for pandemics, the responses that we need in countries and around the world. And so our group over the years has put on some exercises that have tried to illustrate for national leaders, international leaders, the kinds of things that we should expect. And we've worked with leaders in industry to think through the kinds of things that would be needed in an epidemic. Right now, our center is trying to look ahead of the moment we're in the pandemic and trying to think about what kinds of conditions need to be established for reopening governments, reopening society, easing social distancing. We're thinking about the potential uses for technologies, for medicines, vaccines, for diagnostics. And we're trying to work with governments and CDCs to sort through what needs to happen next.
in trying to figure out when we can start to open the economy back up again, I wonder, even if we are able to contain this virus in the United States, if it continues to explode in other parts of the world, can we really reach containment? I mean, what does the future of travel look like?
Yeah, I think containment is going to be difficult. I think when we do have a vaccine, containment might be possible. But I think what we should think about in the meantime is what we can do to mitigate the spread of this disease and the impact of this disease. Ultimately, to get the world going again, it may be that for international travel to start working, we may need to, when vaccine becomes available, provide some kind of evidence of immunity that we've done for other diseases. For example, yellow fever vaccine is required to enter some countries currently. That may be a possibility depending on what the pandemic looks like when vaccine eventually becomes available. But international travel is a dilemma right now, because even for countries that have gotten relatively good control of their epidemics, so places including China and Singapore and Taiwan, we're seeing that international travel and returning travelers are one of the big sources of new cases, and that we'd expect that to be the case around the world. So for countries that get control over time, or better control of their epidemics, will need to be able to think through how they screen international travelers on entry into their country.
The future of travel looks very unpredictable. I saw today that the global death toll has surpassed 120,000. 2 million people are infected. How do you see the trajectory of this pandemic moving?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we are still really at the early stages of this pandemic, even though collectively, we've gone through a lot in the last 3 months, but most of the world has not been infected and is susceptible to this virus. And so we're going to need to really take many mitigation measures over the course of this next 12 to 18 months before we have a vaccine, to try and at least minimize the numbers of people as best we can that ultimately get infected. It does look like right now something on the order of 80,000 new cases a day are diagnosed in the world. Some countries have already come through what looks like the worst and are now doing better and having relatively good control. Some are kind of more in the middle, in the sense of they put social distancing in place and are now beginning to think about how they might get to a point where they could ease social distancing. And other countries still are on the very rapid rise of new cases, and with no signs of plateauing. So we're still early on, unfortunately, very early on in this pandemic.
So, I mean, is there a possibility to even project a roadmap to recovery? And if so, what kinds of healthcare interventions do we need to accelerate?
So there's the two different kind of levels of that question. One would be, what's the roadmap to trying to ease social distancing? And people are really beginning to think a lot about that, trying to figure out ways to do that as safely as possible. So, for example, in our view at our center is that we should have reopening shouldn't occur until there is a clear downward trajectory of cases for a couple of weeks in any given place. We should have diagnostic testing in place so that we can pick up very early new cases that are diagnosed. Our hospitals should be well prepared for rising cases that could follow social distancing easing. And we should have pretty strong public health tracing, contact tracing in place in any place that starts to ease social distancing. So those are the conditions we think are really important for easing social distancing. And your larger question, I think, about recovery, ultimately we do need a vaccine to be able to manage this around the world. In the meantime, other kinds of interventions that might be helpful might be something in the realm of some kind of prophylactic therapy that could be developed that could provide some level of protection, perhaps for the most vulnerable or the most at risk. We don't have any of those therapies developed yet, but I know people are certainly working on them around the world, so that might be a possibility. But those really will be partial measures as compared to what we really need is a vaccine or vaccines that are broadly protective for the population.
Dr. Inglesby, thank you so much for your insights. Now, throughout this show, we've been taking your questions, and I still have Dr. Rinka Boss and Dr. Tom Inglesby here to provide even more insights. So let me get to our questions here. Dr. Boss, we have a question from Pankaj from LinkedIn, and she's asking, at what stage is vaccine development currently?
We have just selected our lead candidate. So that means that we did extensive testing of our different candidate vaccines. And we have shown now that one of those candidates can actually induce those very important neutralizing antibodies to prevent the virus from entering the cell. So we have selected a lead candidate, and we are starting, we just started now to make material that then can be used to really make more vaccines at a larger scale.
And Dr. Inglesby, Shelley from Facebook asks, do we believe COVID-19 to be seasonal or sensitive to heat? I know a lot of people are wondering this.
At this point, we don't really have any evidence that it is. It's possible there could be a slowing down in the warmer months, but there really isn't any evidence of it. And I think the planning assumption for health agencies and for the World Health Organization at this point is that we should not bank on any slowing at this point in terms of our strategy.
Dr. Boss, Sergio from LinkedIn is asking, why does the vaccine take so long? Is it a matter of resources, investigation, money?
It indeed takes a very long time, although the timelines that we are currently having are much shorter than we normally have for developing a vaccine. Normally it takes many years, and now we are doing it within 1 year, even within 7-8 months. So what takes time is the testing. It's very important that we make a good vaccine. You can make a vaccine, but it's very important that it works, because it can also, if it doesn't work well, it can also make the disease worse. So you have to make sure your vaccine does what it needs to do, and it needs to be safe. So that testing, that just takes a lot of time.
Dr. Inglesby, Seema from LinkedIn asks, how important is the data you are collecting today, and how will it help in the future?
Well, I guess there's lots of kind of data that's many different kinds of data that are being collected. I think we're going to learn throughout the course of this epidemic an extraordinary amount. We're already, the numbers of scientific papers and the sharing that's going on internationally is amazing. So I think we are collecting information about, for example, antibody testing and how well that an infection protects you against future infections, and does an antibody test itself show you whether or not you're infected in the future, or whether you're protected against infection in the future. So there are all sorts of things that are happening based on data that's being collected around the world and shared pretty widely and pretty quickly. So that is, I think, a sign of progress, the way that data is being shared and people are working together.
It still just astounds me. I never thought that within our lifetime we would experience something like a global pandemic. It just really seemed like the stuff of history, but here we are. And Dr. Boss, Dr. Inglesby, thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you so much for being with us today. That is it for this episode of The Road to a Vaccine. We all know that the road is challenging. There's still so much that is unknown by our guests, and how we as a global community are coming together in so many ways. I hope you all will keep submitting your questions to jnj.com/road-to-a-vaccine, and we'll be answering more on Tuesday of next week on another live episode. In closing, once again, I thank our guests for joining us today. Thank you all for watching. And most importantly, I want to thank all of those frontline healthcare workers. We'll see you next week.
you how we are grateful to you.